guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well and that you've had a good week. I know times are a little bit tough right now, but hopefully we're all making it through and we're getting through together. If you guys are new to this channel, like I said, my name's Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist. From time to time, I do talk about crimes from other nationalities. If that is something you guys want to hear more about, just let me know in the comments below. But hopefully, if this is appealing to you guys, you will like these videos. Hopefully you'll subscribe, you'll share if you want to, hit the notification bell and leave me some comments. I always love to hear people's ideas on things, particularly if I miss anything in a crime that you guys want to know about or want to hear more about. If you guys do choose to leave comments, though, please, no hate. There's enough hate out in the world already. It is. And we're just here to talk about things. If you guys are returning subscribers, you guys already know how much I love you and how thankful I am that you guys let me into your living room or wherever you choose to watch this at least once a week. Now, that being said, guys, I'm not going to spend too much into an intro for this. You guys know this is part 3, Bernardo and Homolka. I don't know if you're tired, but I am tired. Once again, graphic warnings, guys. I've got to put it up. Trigger warnings, particularly spousal abuse we're going to deal with at this point in time, and also talking about the rapes and the murders of young girls. So if that is stuff that bothers you guys or triggers you in any way, these may not be the videos for you to watch. Hopefully next week we'll cover something that everybody can watch, but this video might not be for you if that's triggering. These videos are for entertainment or educational purposes only, guys. So I mean no disrespect to anybody. I know that in the last few videos, it may have sounded like I was nicer, if you will, to Paul Bernardo. I'm not a fan of his. He's a criminal. He's a psychopath. He's a sexual sadist. I guess I was just giving you guys background information on the fact that he didn't have a good home life. We know that sometimes that leads to people doing the things that they do. I think it almost sounds more like I'm attacking Carla. Just in case, you know, I'm guessing some of you probably felt that vibe. I live in Ontario, guys, so you know how we already feel about the two of these. But I just wanted to highlight, I guess, the differences between the two. First of all, he's a man, and to be honest with you, and I'm really sorry about saying it, but we expect crimes like this from a man. When a woman takes part and is willing in it, it's an anomaly. I think that's why we're harsher on her. She should have been more maternal, if you will, and she was not. So we're gonna get into it. So it's 1993, guys. Just the very start of 1993. It's January. Paul had just come back from that trip to Montreal. And when he came back, he was spiraling even more than he normally would have. Like, he was already disassembling at this point, guys. Everything was getting to him too much. He didn't have any way of maybe acknowledging what he did. He is a psychopath. He doesn't feel empathy. He doesn't feel remorse. But I think it was getting to him. Not in the ways we would assume, but in other ways. So he was heavily disassembling. So right after New Year's, when he did get back, he beat Carla voraciously, guys. He really did beat her. And someone from the pet clinic actually called up Dorothy Homolka and told her about it. Now, at this point in time, Paul was blaming Carla for everything. He blamed her for the death of Tammy, which really incited the whole thing, other than the Scarborough rapes. That was something he did to himself. But the murders, it was the murder of Tammy Lynn that started it all with regards to their murder spree. He blamed her for that. He blamed her because none of the advances that he had towards Jane or towards Tammy's friends ended up working. And he also just blamed her for life in general. So he was beating her pretty heavily at this point in time. He had been, from the sounds of it, through most of 1992. People prior to this beating, there's not a lot of photographic evidence that exists of her, or either her on the tape. This is with regards to her on the tapes as well, with regards to her having bruises or anything like that on her body. There were some people that mentioned things as her wedding approached, But most people at this point in time had no idea there was abuse going on. And I don't think the abuse was as heavy as this particular time. So this was the infamous flashlight beating, guys. There are many pictures of it. I'm going to show you one. I actually just got this new book. I just wanted to see what it was about. It's filled with some pictures, guys. I've seen pictures. Probably more so than I ever wanted to see. I'm just going to see if I can find the actual photograph I'm looking for. Yeah, that's it right there. Her with the raccoon eyes. I'm pretty sure you guys can see it. This was a pretty bad beating. But this was not the beating that she went to the hospital for. So, of course, he beat her, and everybody called. There was a concerned friend at the pet clinic that did call Dorothy. Police were summoned to 57 Bayview Drive, but nobody was home. Paul and Carla were out on a cigarette smuggling run at that point in time. So when they were driving home from the cigarette smuggling run, he beat her again. And this was the one beating where he was like beating her legs. He actually broke some of her ribs in it, etc., etc. He beat her pretty much all the way home. He then told her they were going to have anal sex, and she was like, okay. And then he strangled her with a ligature. He did put it around her neck, and he was choking her. She didn't. I don't think she had the marks around her neck, but she did say that he did do that. So once again, the concerned colleague called Dorothy Homolka and told her she better do something. Her daughter was in pretty rough shape. Dorothy went down and was actually able to speak to her daughter and saw what had gone on. So later that night, she and Lori both physically dragged Carla out of the house. She still did not want to leave. They dragged her out of the house and took her to the hospital. With regards to that, she kept saying that people wouldn't understand. You don't understand. You don't understand. And everybody was taking it as, oh, you don't understand. I love him so much. But it was more or less, you don't understand. We've done these horrific crimes. They were both afraid to be separate from each other because I think each of them thought the other would tell. Or with regards to Carla, I don't know if she thought that Paul would tell. I think it was somehow that evidence would come out and she'd be implicated. Oh, sorry, guys. So at this point in time, police are still not on to Paul Bernardo, guys. They have no idea. Even though he's technically a suspect in the Scarborough rapes, and they're still testing his DNA at this point in time. He's not in the system for that. They pretty much ignored the stalking reports that they had from the two women that actually directly linked Paul's car to his name. So they knew his actual name at this point. They were ignoring the assault reports from a previous girlfriend, as well as the report she made when she wanted her money back. And they were also ignoring the reports by various friends and coworkers who said that he looked exactly like the Scarborough rapist composite, and also described his demeaning sex practices and how he treated Carla. So police at this point in time, Bernardo is not on their radar as of early 1993. Police still believed at this point in time that the car they were looking for with regards to Kristen French's abduction was the beige Camaro, the older model beige Camaro. They would not give that up. They were still assuming that. This is one of the reasons why they cleared Paul Bernardo in May of 1992, is because he didn't drive that car. They're very much fixated on it, particularly Inspector Vince Bevan. He headed the Green Ribbon Task Force, and that was one of his major things. They were also at this point in time still eyeing John Peter Stark, who was a murderer of young girls, for the death of Leslie Mahaffey. They thought it made sense that her death fit in more with him. They were still looking at him. However, when it was proven that it wasn't him, Inspector Bevan had to tell the public that lead didn't pan out. And the police were getting a lot of criticism from the public at this point in time, because every single lead that they ever had with regards to Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, nothing came out of them. So if you have to remember, one occurred in 91, one occurred in 92. It's now 93, and people are scared. They did, however, at this point in time, link Kristen's death and Leslie's death. They knew from the abduction report, we're going to call it the abduction report because the lady didn't actually see a struggle or anything like that. She just saw 3 individuals and this car at, after Kristen was done school. So she thought that the people involved were 2 guys, or she said there were 2 people and the police assumed they were 2 men and that they were blue collar workers. That's what they were saying. They even had profilers from the States come up from Quantico. Greg McCrary actually was one of them. And that was the profile they did. These were 2 blue collar workers. But police were able to link the deaths, and it was for one really specific reason. So when we talked about Kristen French being found on Side Road 1, it was in Burlington, right, guys? She was found in, it's almost like a ditch, but it's like a junk place too. People just throw their junk there. When she was found, that was about 30 yards or so. I might be a little bit wrong on that. From the cemetery that Leslie Mahaffey was interred at. So both found in Burlington. Yes, they were found in different ways. Leslie was cut apart, encased in cement, and in Lake Gibson. Kristen was nude, beaten very badly, had her hair all chopped off, all shaved off, and very battered. I did just say that, but she was very battered. But they were able to link their deaths because they figured the killer was kind of like playing a sick, twisted joke by leaving them so close together. So they did link their deaths at that point in time. Carla was assessed by the doctors at the hospital, and one of the doctors actually said that hers was the worst case of spousal abuse he had ever seen. The flashlight beating was basically endgame for them, guys. So early January, the 2 of them are done. They were married for a year and a half at this point and had killed 3 people. But this was the end game for them. They did not see each other again in any type of capacity unless it was in court after this. I should also mention, guys, that in the summer of 92, I believe it was the summer of 92, Paul and Carla changed their names. It would be their last name. Paul changed his name from Paul Kenneth Bernardo to Paul Jason Teal. Jason for the serial killer, from the Friday the 13th movies. And their last name became Teal because of a Canadian movie. It's actually called Criminal Law, and it's about a serial killer. The serial killer's last name is Teal. It's just spelled differently, and Paul and Carla like that. So that's what they decided to change it to, in homage of one of their favorite movies. So Paul was actually arrested for the assault, just for the assault, on January 5th of 1993. He did try to get a hold of Carla after this, and he did contact her parents. He tried to have friends contact her parents, but Carla seemingly had vanished. And of course, the Homolkas would never they wouldn't give him the time of day. They would never let him talk to Carla anyway. At this point in time, Paul is very afraid that she's either going to tell people in general or she's going to tell the police something. He needs her there. She's his sounding board. She's how he is able to do his fantasies. They kind of need each other at this point in time, or he feels he needs her. Yes, he's a psychopath, but she was like his best friend's sounding board, even though he was highly abusive to her and heaping abuse on her. It was a weird dynamic, but he needed her. So, of course, he couldn't find her. Well, it's because at this point in time, Carla had relocated to Brampton, which is just outside of Toronto, and was living with her maternal uncle, Carl Seeger. Calvin Seeger. Sorry. She was living with her maternal uncle, Calvin Seeger. It's not funny. I always screw up names. I'm sorry, guys. Calvin Seeger and her Aunt Patty. And, she was just relaxing and trying to heal from everything that had gone on. But this did not stop Carla from having a good time. It almost seemed like the past 2 years hadn't happened, or even the past 5 years with Paul. She was basically her old self, and she didn't seem like she was suffering too much. But it was like she put on different masks for different people. So to her aunt and uncle, she seemed like the victim. To her friends, she was like, yes, Paul was abusive. Paul was a terrible man. I'm getting divorced, because she kept up all her correspondence with them and would tell them everything that had been going on. And of course, she painted herself as the victim. She didn't mention the crimes. She painted herself as the victim in a terrible marriage and that Paul was a really bad guy. She was also advised at this point in time by the therapists to keep a journal of sorts or a diary of all the times that he ever abused her. And this was a voluminous diary, guys. She wrote a lot in it, and she wrote it like ferociously. Let's just say she had a big diary from this. It remains to be seen if all the stuff she said was true. Some of it was. We know there was a flashlight beating. We know that she said as far back as 1988 he was hitting her. We know that in 1991 some of the people from the wedding party had questioned it. The prostitute they had in Atlantic City had questioned her about the bruises too. So while Carla was away and Paul's out on bail, he starts to record the suicide tapes, or what is known as the suicide tapes. Basically, they were just tapes of him telling Carla how much he loved her and he missed her and how sorry he was. He was calling her like pal, saying that he should have looked into her eyes more when they had relations, things of that nature. He pretended to hit himself. I'm going to say pretended because I doubt he actually did it, with a flashlight at one point in time. He's like, oh God, it hurts so much. He's like, I'm hitting myself with the flashlight so you know how it feels. And he'd go on and dub music over it and all these soliloquies, and somehow hoping that they would get to Carla. He claims that he was going to kill himself in all of these. There is absolutely no evidence that the man ever tried to harm himself. That does not seem like something he would do, but he was trying to play on her emotions at this point in time. She never heard the suicide tapes. I don't think he was ever able to give them to her. I don't know if they were in court or not. I'm just saying. So Carla at this point in time was living quite the life. Her aunt and uncle had taken her out to a bar. I should say that for the past year, Carla had been drinking quite a lot. They had been partying quite a lot. Now, she says it's because Paul made her, but after they separated, she began drinking even more. And Paul also began drinking more and popping pills as well. So she's at this bar, and this bar is a bar called the Sugar Shack. Sorry. And she meets up with a man. This man's name is Jim Hutton. I'm not sure if that's a pseudonym, guys. It's just given as that in the books. So she met up with Jim Hutton, and she did the same thing as she did with Paul, guys. She took him to bed pretty much that night. They had danced, they'd had conversations. It's almost like with Paul. Remember, they had that really long conversation, and then they ended up in the sheets. Well, basically the same thing with her and Jim. She only told him at that point in time that she was getting out of a bad marriage. Didn't talk about a whole lot. They were, more physical. She was getting out of a bad marriage, and she had some legal troubles. Everything else he found out from the news. He had no idea who she was or anything like that. And at this point in time, there wasn't a whole lot out there anyway about her. In fact, the only thing they had at this point in time was that she was the victim of assault. This man, though, the interesting thing about Jim Hutton is that he looked very similar to Paul Bernardo, and that he drove a really similar car to Paul. However, Carla didn't know, but Paul actually got rid of the Nissan after she left. I'm wondering if it's because he figured she might tell the police, and started driving a Mercury Marquis. Carla thought it was really neat to some degree. Like she had a type herself where she was like, oh my God, this guy looks almost like Paul and he drives the same car. Can you believe it? Like she wrote that to her friends. So she even wrote in her diary at this point in time, quote, I'm not afraid he'll tell any of my secrets. He has everything to lose on two things and a lot to lose on a third, end quote. So I don't even know if she went so far as to write the actual secrets down in the diary or just hint around at them. Paul, at this point in time, in his suicide notes, said, quote, he was less than zero, end quote. So Carla at this point in time had called the bank and found out that Paul had ran up all her credit cards using cash advances, right? This was his form of revenge on her, I guess. And so she canceled the cards, but to retaliate, she called customs on him, gave his description, gave the fact that he'd used fake license plates, description of the car, told them his name, and basically said he was a cigarette smuggler so that they'd stop him when he came into the country. In late January of 93, so some I've read more than one book, guys. I showed you the 2 books that I took a lot of my information from, and I've read more than one article too. And then I have this 3rd book that just came in. 4th book, 5th book, something like that. And some sources say January 30th. Some sources say February 1st. So I'm just going to go with February 1st. The DNA results finally came back 26 months later, after Paul Bernardo had originally given his first sample, and he had to be rechecked again. They came back in, or the results finally came in. And of course, their number one suspect, the person that committed these crimes, was Paul Kenneth Bernardo. He was their man. They finally had him for something. They had him forensically linked to several of the Scarborough rapes. And since they were all pretty much carbon copies of each other, various ways of raping, vaginally, orally, anally, ligature, knife, scripted responses, long periods of time, mostly in Scarborough. There was the one on Henley Island, and there was the one in Peel Region. He's since actually, I think it was like in 2006, he actually admitted to more too. But they had their man finally. So Toronto police called up Niagara police, because they're like, oh my God, you guys have a serial sexual predator in your backyard. We just want you guys to know that. At this point in time, Niagara kind of clued in and figured to themselves, this person might be responsible for French and Mahaffey. Toronto police did not believe that about Paul Bernardo. They believed he was only the Scarborough rapist, that he didn't have any more crime, that he wasn't involved in any more crimes. But they decided to work together to see if he was both of their man. They were both going to work together. This doesn't happen very often in jurisdictions, guys, particularly in the past. Police don't like to share information with each other. I mean, from time to time they will, but they don't generally like to, because they want to be the person that solves the crime. However, at this point in time, in this case, police were sharing information. And the reason Toronto wasn't convinced is because he didn't drive the Camaro. They were still fixated on that. That is the reason why they weren't convinced that Paul Bernardo was good for the murders of Kristen and Leslie, is because of that. They made arrangements at this point in time to interview Carla, newly estranged wife. They figured she would give information. On the 29th of January, I should also mention, in 1993, that Paul Bernardo had written a letter on behalf of his father for the courts. If you guys can remember from the last video, Debbie Bernardo had finally come forward after watching her father, or hearing about, I should say hearing, not watching. After hearing about her father molesting her own child, she came forward and finally reported everything that had happened to her. Paul had this to say, quote, "It is my opinion that this issue was put to rest years ago," end quote. He also said that he didn't think it would serve any purpose to force his father into jail, that the man shouldn't have to do any jail time. So agents, of course, at this point in time, quickly seized Paul's car, and they also seized the rest of his illegal cigarettes. His drug smuggling days were over in early February of 1993. Carla knew that police officers were coming to interview her. They figured it was due to the Scarborough rapes. I'm not quite sure how she got that information, but I'm assuming it must have been in the paper. So she knew that they were coming to talk to her. They had phoned her and set it up. She was expecting 2 police officers. 4 showed up. When 4 showed up, she became suspicious. She knew she figured they had some type of information about the French and Mahaffey cases. She figured that. She's fairly smart, guys. Her IQ is literally 131. So she's fairly smart. She's able to piece it together. And of course, one of the officers was from the Green Ribbon Task Force. Actually, I think it was 2 of them. So she very much knew. She, at the very start, when they were talking about Paul and regards to the Scarborough rapes and their relationship together, she answered everything, matter-of-factly. She answered it as well as she could. But when they brought up the date, April 16th of 1992, the date Kristen French went missing, she became really nervous and was clearly agitated. And she didn't really answer the questions as well. Police suspected she knew more than what she was saying, and she suspected that police had more information on them than what she was hearing from them, but neither side gave in to each other at that point in time. So Carla suspected that there was going to be an imminent arrest for her. She knew it was coming very soon. And she was very freaked out about this. She was freaking out after they left the whole night. Her aunt and uncle were really bewildered about it. Obviously, she'd never mentioned anything aside from the abuse to them. So they kept asking her, and she would come up with, or she would respond to them, quote, "They know everything," end quote, and quote, "You don't understand, I can't tell you," end quote. Of course, they'd been hearing this "you don't understand" stuff for the most part for about a month now. They figured it was just about the abuse. They had no idea what was coming forward. And eventually her Aunt Patty did get her to crack. She asked her if Carla's problem had to do with Kristen and Leslie, and Carla verified it. She said yes. And finally she cracked on Kristen and Leslie. She told her Aunt Patty everything. Her Aunt Patty didn't view her differently. It wasn't like that, guys. It wasn't like, she was horrified, obviously, but Carla convinced her and almost everybody else that she was a victim in all of this, and that Paul coerced her and forced her to take part in this. She omitted Tammy. She omitted Jane. At this point in time, Jane didn't even know she was raped. The police didn't have the tapes or anything like that. So no one knew anything about Jane, including Jane herself. And everybody thought Tammy Lynn's death was accidental. Conveniently, Carla wasn't ready to disclose about that yet, so she opted not to say anything about that. Sorry. So Patty, of course, told Kelvin in the morning. He had been asleep, and the two of them decided that Carla needed a really good lawyer. So they contacted George Walker. He's from Niagara Falls. And incidentally, Carla actually knew his wife. Their dog used to come into the Martindale animal clinic. So she actually knew George Walker's wife, and through that, and of course she trusted him because she found that link between them. Police also at this point in time had 24-hour surveillance on Paul Bernardo. They hadn't picked him up yet. They were surveilling him to see if there was anything else to do with the French and Mahaffey cases as well. So they were trailing him. He kind of suspected it. So he was able to fight off his urges, so to speak. Like, he kind of figured he was being followed. So the rapes are over. He was done with that part. Pretty much because it wasn't because he wanted to be done at all with it, guys. Like, this was very much a big part of his life, but because he knew he was being followed, or he was pretty sure he was being followed. So Carla did tell George Walker everything. And, you know, she had been freaking out before with her aunt and uncle, but George Walker somehow made her feel better. I think he was the one that started her along the lines of the battered women syndrome. And don't quote me on that one though, guys. And as such, Carla felt more optimistic. In fact, she was thinking she could get complete and utter immunity for her role within the crimes. Particularly at this point in time, they don't have the tapes. The truth is, at this point in time, guys, the prosecutors didn't have anything else linking Paul Bernardo to Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. They only had Carla and Carla's word for everything, and Carla's confessions to George Walker and her aunt and uncle. They had nothing else, guys. There was no DNA. There was no physical evidence. No one had seen him talking to Leslie. No one had ever seen them talking before. There was no link like that. No one was able to describe him, that lady, wasn't able to describe him with regards to the abduction of Kristen French. So no one knew. It was just Carla, and that's all they had. So they knew they'd have to make a deal with her. However, they did have some foresight. Prosecution knew they needed her, and so they had to make the deal sweet enough that she'd go along with it. But they also knew that there would be a huge public outcry if they didn't at least charge her with something, if she wasn't held to some degree for her roles and everything. I mean, it was her husband and she was there, so they knew she had to. So that's how they came up with this 10 years. And it was Ray Houlihan was actually the Crown prosecutor who helped hammer out the deal. Originally, prosecutors wanted 18 years. They were able to talk it down because of the information Carla knew to 10 years. At this point in time, nobody knows about Tammy. So she was getting 5 years for Kristen and 5 years for Leslie. And she was okay with that, so to speak. The lawyer for the ministry, sorry guys, the lawyer for the Ministry of the Attorney General, so this is Murray Siegel, also signed off on it. Because this is such an unusual case, it had to actually be taken up to the highest level it possibly could be in order to have it hammered out. So prosecution was able to agree on this. Of course, this is the infamous deal with the devil, guys. The deal with the devil. However, no one knew to what extent Carla participated. They didn't know she was willing. They didn't know she was eager. They didn't know about Jane. They didn't know she was the one who actually brought Jane to the house. Paul never knew Jane. It was only Carla that did. They didn't know that she had set up Jane as a wedding present for Paul or Tammy as a Christmas present for Paul. They didn't know any of that. All they had was her word. And she made it seem like she was forced to do it. She was coerced to do it. She was beaten down. She was compliant. She was submissive, all because her husband forced her to be. She very much negated her role within it to like a small area. And of course, there is something called marital privilege here in Canada. I actually had to look up to see if it still exists, and it does. A husband or a wife can't be forced to testify against their significant other in court, against their partner in court. They can be subpoenaed, but all they have to do is basically say no comment. They don't actually have to provide details from anything they talked about while they were married. So Carla's still married to Paul at this point in time. In order for her to be able to go up on the stand and testify against him, she'd need a divorce. And she wanted that anyway, so it didn't really matter to her. She'd finally found her backbone. She was out there having some fun, and she was more than willing to take the stand against her ex-husband. So like I said before, guys, the Crown literally had no choice but to take Carla's words at face value. They had nothing else linking Bernardo to these two cases. And they agreed to do this deal, even though it meant manslaughter charges for Carla. That's basically, she was charged with manslaughter, guys. It was manslaughter. Which you guys know, less blame, less consequence, more accidental in nature, less jail time. They came up with this deal. They were hesitant to do the deal, but they did it because she was the only thing they had. That is why it's called the deal with the devil. They had no other choice but to make this deal. This way they can put Paul Bernardo behind bars, as he should be, for murders. And you guys have to remember that without Carla, the police would still have been on the trail of this old Camaro, and they probably would have never found Paul Bernardo. He and Carla knew too much about DNA at the time when they killed Leslie and Kristen. That's why they treated their bodies the way they did, because they didn't want any of their DNA being found on the bodies. So like I said, Paul suspected that the police were following him. He suspected that Carla had already told the police, which he was kind of right. He suspected that he was being followed, and he also suspected that they had bugged his house. He was getting really paranoid now, particularly because he figured that Carla had told on him. I should say, in the days that came before the officers actually coming to the house, Carla never had any intentions of telling on Paul. She never would tell their secret. The reason being, not because she wanted to protect Paul, because she wanted to protect herself, guys. To implicate Paul would have implicated Carla, and she needed a way to not do this. This is another reason why the deal worked out so well for her. This was her way of saying, oh my God, it happens, but I was forced to do it, so she could kind of negate her role even further. So like I said, she was charged with the 2 manslaughters, 5 and 5, and she pled guilty. She pled guilty to manslaughter. That's what they wanted her to. That's why she had this deal. Of course, she would have to be booked, though. She would have to be charged and booked. The police, though, made it super easy for her. They actually offered her a ride, guys. They offered her a ride to and from the police station. She would be booked, but she'd be allowed to leave immediately on bail. She could go back home with her parents that night. She would never have to spend time in a jail cell at this point in time. So she, of course, let that happen. So Paul was officially arrested February 17th, 1993. And the first arrest was for 50 plus sexual assaults. Well, his actual first arrest was for the assault on Carla, but the arrest on February 17th was for 50 plus. Yeah, you heard me, guys. 50 plus sexual assaults. They also brought him in and tried to interview him, but of course it didn't work at all, guys. He's a psychopath. He knows what they want and he won't give it to them. Most of the questions he answered were no comment. Like, it almost made it seem like he was gonna say something and then he'd say no comment. He was very cool. He was very relaxed. It was like nothing bothered him at all. In the days following February 17th, he was actually arraigned for, booked, I should say, for the 2 murders as well. Inspector Vince Bevan did go before the media and said, quote, said there was another person involved. He didn't give any details about this other person, including their gender. And he said, quote, that person poses no threat to the community, end quote. However, the tabloids, you know how sneaky the tabloids are, guys. They were able to get a hold of pictures of Carla, and particularly the beating picture, right? And as such, she was splashed all over the tabloids. So it got out pretty fast. I just want to make sure. Just give me 1 second, guys, and I'll show you. So there's what we remember right there. Hopefully it's not too blurry. That's from when she was in court, actually. And I will, sorry, 1 more second. And there's the 2 of them at the time of their arrests, side by side. So gone are the Baywatch good looks, right? Carla then checked herself into a mental health facility in Toronto. It's actually called the Northwestern Hospital. So the psychiatric ward of the Northwestern Hospital. And she did this so that she could kind of understand, I guess, more or less what led her to do these things. Like, she wanted a diagnosis, but I think the Crown also wanted a diagnosis just to see, like, battered woman or was it something else? No one ever agrees on the diagnosis for Carla anyway, and we'll get into that, guys. We will talk about that later on. But also they were giving her drugs. She claimed she needed drugs to cope, particularly with regards to sleep. She said she couldn't sleep. Guilty conscience maybe, but she said she couldn't sleep. And when I say that she had an aptitude for drugs, guys, oh my God, this girl had an astounding aptitude for therapeutical drugs, to the point where she actually asked the hospital to administer them through IV. And the hospital said no, obviously. She got very demanding about it, so they just gave them to her intramuscularly. I can't believe this. But even they said that she was demanding and manipulative. At one moment, she could appear perfect and little and girly, like she was just some little schoolgirl herself. And at other times, she was very brash, loud, demanding, vociferous, all of those things. This is actually shown in the videotapes with the police taking her through a walk view of 57 Bayview Drive. I'm not sure if any of you have seen them. I have. They They were on the Fifth Estate. You know, I have to mention the CBC somewhere in here. And she was very straightforward, very matter of fact when she was talking about the murders themselves, very cold, no emotion. But when she was talking about her hope chest or some of her clothes, she'd be like, I want that back. Can I get that back? She was very much like that. And I don't know what possessed her to do this, but when she went through the walkthrough with the police, she actually dressed up like a schoolgirl. I'm not even joking. Like the kilt, everything. It was horrifying. Like she was making a mockery of it. But regardless. So it was while she was in the hospital that she finally wrote a letter to her parents explaining what happened to Tammy Lynn, saying that Paul, like I said, she very much nullified her role in it. She made it seem very, very minuscule. Paul made her do it. Paul killed Tammy. Paul had me get the drugs, and this is what happened. So she actually wrote a letter to her parents. She was terrified. She was terrified of her parents finding out. She figured they'd hate her. They never did. Her family still supports her to this day. I believe she still talks to them, including her other sister, Lori. So they do very much support her. And as far as I know, Dorothy actually, and possibly Carl too, actually suspected that Paul had something to do with Tammy dying. They just couldn't put their finger on it. So she wrote the letter. The letter, of course, was immediately given to the authorities. And that's where the 2 for Tammy comes from. She was actually only given 2 more years with regards to manslaughter for her own sister. That's why she got 12 years. So detectives scoured 57 Bayview Drive, guys, looking for evidence, specifically the tapes. Carla had asked them about sex tapes. I don't think she really let them know everything that was on them, but she asked them if they'd found the tapes yet, the sex tapes, and police hadn't. So of course they want the tapes, but they want to see if they can find DNA and things like that in 57 Bayview Drive. They didn't find it. They didn't find it. They were there for 71 days and they missed the tapes by millimeters. Carla thought that Paul had them in the garage above the rafters or in his music room, like in a closet in his music room. She didn't know that Paul had actually moved them to a bathroom, but it would be like up behind the pot lights in the rafters up there. He'd hidden them pretty deeply in there. So literally, guys, the people that had looked, the investigators missed them by millimeters. They didn't handle the scene like a lot of other searches in houses. They were very respectful towards the owners of the house, because remember, Paul and Carla were actually just renting, and they would only punch walls or punch holes in walls in certain areas and only take tiles off of the roof in certain areas. They wouldn't necessarily look all over like they were supposed to. So it's really not any wonder that they didn't miss the tapes. But regardless, after 71 days, they did not find the tapes. And these are 6 tapes, guys. There were 6 tapes in all. Bernardo knew that they were looking for the tapes, so he contacted his lawyer. After he was arraigned, he had hired Ken Murray to represent him. And he told Murray about the tapes. So Murray went to the house on the last day of the search, ostensibly saying that he needed to get stuff for Paul, like clothes and stuff, right? Because, you know, he's not at the house anymore. They said yes. He went in there, and along with he brought out garbage bags of stuff. And in the garbage bags was the tapes. I mean, he had clothes for Paul as well, but the tapes were in there. He sat on those tapes. He sat on those tapes for 17 months, guys. He actually made copies of them too. It was himself, his assistant, and I believe she was an intern or something else along those lines. They were the only people that knew about the tapes. Himself and he had watched them all. I don't think the assistant or the intern watched them until much later. I don't know if the intern ever saw them. I know the assistant did later on. So they knew about the tapes. However, the defense is not required by law to hand the tapes over. The Crown has to let the defense know everything that they're using against their client. Okay, they have to. It's just one of those things. But in order for the defense to build a case and use the defense they choose, they're able to suppress some evidence. Not a lot of evidence, and I don't know if suppress is the right word. It's more like they bring it out during trial. But the tapes are really damning, right? And ethically and morally, Ken Murray should have given the tapes to police. He didn't. He sat on them. It was a no-win situation for him, though, guys. It's not like he wanted to pervert the course of justice, okay? He was hired to defend Paul Bernardo. And as such, as a lawyer, it is your duty to defend your client as best as you possibly can, to the best level that you can. It's your duty to your client. So he couldn't win on that case. Morally and ethically, he should have handed them in. He wasn't required to by law, even though we feel like he should have. He technically wasn't required to by law, and he couldn't win. He couldn't win. I mean, he could have come forward a lot sooner, but regardless. So interestingly enough, Ken Murray actually had the tapes in his hand and had viewed them for a week before Carla her deal was officially inked, and that was on May 14th of 1993. It was official then. It can't be overturned. So we're going to get into that in 1 second, guys. I just want to reiterate, he had the tapes. He could have given them to the police and just recused himself from the case. She would have never had the deal. They would have got her for first-degree murder. These crimes were done in tandem with sexual assaults. She would have automatically gotten first-degree murder. Regardless. I'm sorry. Regardless. So, like I said, May 14th, 1993, the deal with the devil was fully on the books. It was okay. Everybody accepted it. It was good to go. It was formally sealed. So, or it was formally formalized. So at this point in time, she can't be retried for it. You know, I wrapped my head around this. I really racked my brain as to why she was never tried for other crimes, particularly that of Tammy and Jane, the rapes on Jane. I have no idea why the rapes on Jane, she was never arraigned for in any way after she had served her time, because that's not talked about. It was only the 3 murders. She has already pled guilty at this point, guys. She's already been convicted at this point in time. The deal has already been made. It's already set in stone. It's already in motion. For them to come back and say, no, we're going to upgrade these charges, or now they can't. They only gave her 2 years for Tammy. It can't be upgraded. Neither can the 5 for Kristen or the 5 for Leslie. They can't be overturned, guys. If so, it's double jeopardy. She's already been convicted of that crime. You can't retry her and change the ending of it because of that. We might want it to, but like it or not, that's the way the deal is. However, she was supposed to fully disclose everything she knew, and they knew from the tapes that she didn't. I don't know why they didn't get her on obstruction charges for that. I don't know if they figured... To be honest with you guys, I don't have an answer for that one. I don't know why they didn't get her for obstruction charges, other than the fact that she could say, well, we were making a movie and he made me be that way, or he'd beat me, right? It's a he said, she said at this point in time with the tapes. But regardless, nobody has, well, Ken Murray. The Crown doesn't have the tapes at this point in time. Oh, and this is another galling factor. So when she was actually like going to jail, when they actually came and she had to go to jail finally, she was more worried about what she would wear to the actual jailhouse and if they'd have hair dye for her in prison. She was very worried about that. God forbid her roots come in. Paul was actually formally charged with 9 counts in the deaths of Kristen and Leslie. Sorry, guys. He got 2 for forcible confinement, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping and sexual assault, and 1 count of indignity to a human body with regards to Leslie. So this would be formally in May of 93. A publication ban was actually put out on the case. Okay, it had made international news, right? The Ken and Barbie killers. We didn't call them that. That was from the States, but I guess we're not that good with names. Not that good with tricky monikers. With better monikers. There we go. But it made international news. This was a really good young couple that had seduced and lured, and I shouldn't say seduced, that had assaulted, raped, kidnapped, made tapes. They were very young. I mean, I think Paul at this point was 29 and Carla was just 23. So they were very young and they were a good looking couple. Of course, it's going to be big news. But there was a publication ban. So the reporters from Canada were allowed to sit in on Carla's trial. It wasn't really a trial, guys. It's just where she went in and pled guilty and then told all the facts of the case. And that started June 28th of 1993. So our journalists were allowed to go in and sit in and hear everything. They just couldn't report on it until after Paul's case. No international news were allowed in there because they didn't want to taint the jury pool for Paul's trial. In order for him to get a fair trial, I know, nobody could report on the details of the crime. As of yet, they'd have to wait until his actual trial. In Carla's trial, the Crown reiterated, okay, they did, that they needed Carla. That the only reason that she got the deal was because she was the only thing they had linking Bernardo to the deaths of French and Mahaffey, and subsequently Tammy. She was the only thing that they had. It was only her word that they had. They would have liked to give her more time, but that's just not the way things unfolded. They needed her to put him behind bars. So they reiterated that. And of course, the defense said that Carla was a battered woman, that she was forced, coerced, subjugated into doing these things. They also said she was admitting guilt because she was trying to right some of the wrongs she and Paul had done. Yeah, I know. So she pled guilty, and as you guys know from watching Amuzi Charlie Kakasic's video, that goes a long way. Actually, even in watching the Belcher Island massacres, it goes a long way when you acknowledge your guilt within the courts. So generally, there's less prison time that way too. Reporters were very sympathetic toward Carla. They did see the pictures, of course, with her with the raccoon eyes and everything. They were sympathetic towards her. After they heard that she set up her own sister to be raped by Paul Bernardo, they stopped feeling sympathy for her. In their eyes, after they heard that, she became very unbelievable. All her credibility kind of flew out the window after they heard that she set up her own sister for Paul. I mean, it was at Paul's urging, but Jane wasn't. However, they didn't know about Jane at this point in time. So lots of people actually tried to profit off of this. People in Canada knew what had happened. Our reporters and journalists knew, but Paul and Carla had friends too. And these are friends and family members. One of Carla's uncles did it too. Were quite willing to sell out Paul and Carla to people in the States. They told the Washington Post. You remember those tabloid news news talk shows that they had at night, like A Current Affair? And Hard Copy. I don't know if things like that still are on TV. But they went and told, I think it was Hard Copy, and I'm pretty sure it was Van Smearness that did it. Sold out Paul and Carla too, to the States. So the States had been clamoring, right? They wanted information. They wanted to know what was going on, but they weren't allowed to. This was how they got their information. And of course, it leaked its way to England. The New York Times had been reporting on it. They had like Hard Copy, like I said, the Washington Post. There were other avenues because there were people that were quite willing to sell out Paul and Carla, but also, technically speaking, also the victims as well. People love salacious news for some reason, and this was as salacious as you could get. So of course the publication ban was breached. It was still in place though. I don't know if anybody, I know a little bit. One of the authors of the book, actually, Stephen Williams, was arrested. And he had to plead guilty. This was much later on after he talked to Carla a second time. They used to write in prison, oddly enough. It's a very convoluted story, but eventually he was charged and pled guilty to breaking the publication ban, as well as a couple other things. He still wrote the book, though, and everything he wrote in the book was true. The courts and everybody else was just mad that he had beaten them to the punch, so to speak. So of course, in late 1993, it was breached completely. Canada did not get, but Canada still was not able to report. There were a couple news outlets that did in Canada, but they got in trouble for it. And of course, numerous places in Canada, like the CBC, like Global, all tried to repeal. They all wanted the courts to repeal it, but the courts refused to. So they weren't allowed to report anything until during Paul's trial, until Paul's trial. So Paul's plea was officially entered, I know guys, as not guilty in 1994, in May of 94. He was duly charged with manslaughter for the death of Tammy at this point in time. His trial was postponed for a year, though, because police had actually wiretaped his conversations with Ken Murray, and they pretty much suspected that, from what they were saying, that Ken Murray had the Paul Bernardo tapes, had the tapes that they needed. This was also a catch-22 though, guys, because of course, like I said earlier, Ken Murray can't defend Paul Bernardo and also act as a witness because he'd seen the tapes and also act as a witness for the Crown. So he chose to recuse himself at this point in time. He'd actually contacted the Professional Conduct Committee and asked them what he should do, and they told him to give up the tapes. He gave them to Paul Bernardo's new lawyer, who is John Rosen. I think Rosen only sat on them or viewed them for about 12 days before he gave them to the authorities. So the authorities finally had the tapes and were finally able to see how much of a role Carla had in the crimes. But this worked out well for Paul, right? He could say, well, it was Carla that killed them all. Now, interestingly enough, Ken Murray was brought up on obstruction of justice charges. There was such a public outcry over the fact that he'd had the tapes for 17 months, that he was brought up on charges, but he was acquitted of those charges in 2000. And Paul and Carla were officially divorced. I don't know if I mentioned it, in February of 1994. On May 1st of 1995, jury selection began in Paul Bernardo's trial. His defense, John Rosen at this point in time knew they could never deny the rape charges, particularly because they had the tapes now. But they could contend that Carla played more of a role in the crimes than what she let on. And they could contend that she was the actual killer. So Paul would say, yes, I raped. Yes, I beat. Yes, I humiliated, but I didn't kill. Carla killed. And then it becomes a he said, she said, right? Because the deaths were not filmed, so to speak. I guess Tammy's technically was. But they cut that off before she completely stopped breathing. But with regards to Kristen and Leslie, their deaths were taped. Dorothy Homolka actually had to testify at Paul's trial, and they did get her to admit she'd never seen any abuse in the relationship prior to early 93 when she saw the raccoon eyes, and when she got the phone calls, I should say. And she had to admit that they always seemed like a loving couple together. She also had to admit that Carla had many times, particularly after she left Paul, where she could have said something about what happened to Tammy, and she didn't until she wrote that letter. The Kristen, Leslie, and Tammy tapes were shown to the court, but they were only shown to the judge, the jury, and Bernardo and his lawyer, which creeps me out so much because Bernardo probably got off on watching them again, but they were only shown to him, or the people I mentioned. Everybody else was able to hear the audio from the tapes, but luckily they didn't have the visuals. These are horrific tapes. As far as I know now, they've all been destroyed because it's been, what, oh my God, it's been 31 years since Tammy was murdered. 31 years this Christmas. So the tapes have all been destroyed. But everybody, the other tapes, the other 4 tapes that included their sexual role play when they pretended to be Tammy and Paul, and all other sex acts that they filmed together, those could be viewed by everybody else, including, the rapes of Jane. They could be viewed by everyone else in the courtroom, so that way everybody could see Carla's role within the tapes. And like I said, it was a dawning horror for us, guys. When these tapes were made public, when people were able to see the tapes, people were able to read about them, people were able to be told of the nature of the tapes. They didn't paint Carla as a forced, submissive, compliant victim who was coerced into everything. They showed her as an enthusiastic and willing participant in everything that he asked of her and in everything that she felt like doing. It was all her and him together enjoying this. That's what it showed. I mean, with the Tammy tape, we mentioned before with the menstruation and how she was disgusted by that. It wasn't the fact that it was her sister she was raping. It was the fact that her sister was menstruating. But they showed her a very willing and active participant in these tapes. She even said at this one point in time, on the tapes, actually, they heard her say it, quote, "I didn't give you my virginity, so I gave you Tammy's instead. I loved you enough to do that," end quote. And of course, she's a star attraction for the whole trial, guys. People want her to pay to some degree for it, but they want to hear what she has to say against her ex-husband. They want to know what happened in this marriage. So people were hanging on her every word. She had to lay out what happened to the court and talked about the sweet, sweet deal she got, because we know she got one. Of course, but she, of course, reiterated blaming him and saying everything was his fault and she was forced to do this. She was a battered woman. She understood now, yada, yada, yada. Before him, she had dreams, she had goals, she had plans for her life. After she met him, she was reserved. She was submissive. She no longer thought that way. She was beaten down, etc., etc. In fact, she even said she was nothing more than an abused sex slave who, quote, whose sole job in life was to do anything to please the man she would eventually marry, end quote. That's one of the quotes that was written in the book. They didn't really make a lot of mention of her character before, her dominance, her manipulation, things like that. This was not her trial as much as we wanted it to be, and as much as in the court of public opinion, it was Carla's trial. She was not on trial here. Paul Bernardo was. But don't worry, John Rosen got his jabs in. For the most part, when asked why she didn't leave, when asked why she didn't leave him when the abuse started, or after Tammy, or after Leslie, or after Kristen, she said, quote, I loved him. For the most part, he was treating me nicely, end quote. And she kept their secrets because to spill the secrets would to be implying her. And she was afraid her family would hate her. She was afraid of what would happen. So that's why she kept the secrets. She did talk about that. She showed very little emotion when she was talking about her sister. She actually showed more emotion when she was talking about Leslie and Carla. When she was talking about Leslie and Kristen. But she showed very little emotion when describing what had happened to the girls. It was very clinical. It was very calculating. However, when she started to talk about the abuse that he'd heaped on her, and the things that she attributed to him, the abuses she attributed that he had done to her, she became very animated and very passionate about it, very filled with emotion. She was only filled with an emotion when it came to something about herself. So In cross examination, John Rosen did get to Carla. He was baiting her. He was purposely baiting her. And Carla claimed to have forgotten about everything after she left Paul, and that's why she didn't tell the police about Kristen, Leslie, Tammy, or Jane, is because she willed herself into forgetting it all right after she left him. That's according to her. That's why she said she didn't go to the police right after she left Paul. Though Paul wasn't going to get off, of course, John Rosen was able to damage Homolka's credibility. Not that it mattered. I mean, they did have the DNA with regards to the Scarborough rapes. So John Rosen was hoping for second-degree murder or manslaughter with regards to Paul Bernardo. He was charged with first-degree murder, but he was hoping that the courts would go that way, particularly because they couldn't deny that the rapes had happened. And he was hoping to damage Carla's credibility enough that he could say, no, look, it might have been her, and get him on get a lesser charge for him. He did show that she was a liar, and he showed that she'd had many chances to contact the police. Carla did, but she refused to, or she didn't, or it was self-preservation. He also showed that she was aggressive. He was able to do that by baiting her constantly about things. And he outlined his own version of the deaths. So these are John Rosen's versions of what may have happened. This is what John Rosen believes happened to Leslie. So for Leslie, he said, quote, 2 small circles almost side by side on her spinal cord. The bruising is consistent with a pair of knees the size of your knees when you held her head down on a pillow and suffocated her, end quote. For the death of Kristen, he said, quote, she asked if she could go to the bathroom and then she gave you a shove and you went after her with the mallet, end quote. So that is how they decided to present what had happened. Remember, guys, we have no idea how the 2 girls actually did die. It wasn't videotaped. And at this point in time, all we have are the words of 2 known liars. I'm sure the version of the truth lies somewhere in between it, but we only have Carla's version, which absolves herself of everything, or Paul's version, which absolves him in the deaths. Paul did actually take the stand. Yeah, he did. He's a psychopath, so any way to stay in the news, right? Any way to draw more attention to himself. For some reason, he thought it would work. He came across as an arrogant jerk, guys. He really did. I mean, he is an arrogant jerk, but he came across that way. But he did say, quote, I did not kill those girls, end quote. He acknowledged he was a rapist. He couldn't very well not. He was caught on tape. And he showed that he was a sexual sadist on the stand, just with the things that he was saying with regard to the sexual practices he was involved in. But he also said, quote, both Carla and me are dominant, end quote. So do with that what you will. So, of course, in the end, September 1st, 1995, Paul was officially convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and, of course, manslaughter with regards to Tammy. Because he didn't actually, murder her. Nobody choked her or anything. It was the drugs, technically speaking. They didn't mean to murder her. It was the drugs, technically speaking, administered by Carla. So, of course, he got manslaughter for that. So, 25 years. And luckily, they found him guilty on all charges. So the aftermath, guys, a lot of you must be wondering. It's been 26 years. So what happened in that time? So Paul Bernardo was actually housed in Kingston for a long time. I think I showed you the picture, guys, but I'll see if I can pull it back up. I actually have. Oh, no. Actually, here's a more recent picture of him. I've actually watched this interview, too. This is one of the ones from 2006 where they were interviewing him about more sexual assaults. I mentioned it prior, where in 2006, he actually came forward and said that he, I think, committed at least 10 more. So he was in Kingston, and then when they shut down Kingston, they moved him to Millhaven. He's in segregation, guys. 23 out of 24 hours a day he spends by himself in a cell. They have to keep him out of the general population. It's too much of a danger for him. He's considered on one of the low tiers, right? Because not only is he a rapist and an abuser, but he murdered children. These were young girls. So he is considered very low on the offender tier, and as such he's kept in segregation. He was briefly engaged to somebody, I know, I'm sorry, in 2014, and she claimed she believed him. So we heard about that. She was a lady from London. That fell apart though. They're not engaged anymore as far as I know. And they did question him, actually, for several other murders, specifically Linda Shaw. So her body was found off the 401 near London in a burned out car, I believe, something of that nature, in 1990. So they thought that he'd be good for that, but he said that Linda, quote, wasn't his type. First of all, she was older. She was a college-age student. She was heavier set, short hair, just not his type. And Carla actually agreed with that. I do remember watching the videos though from 1996.